and welcome. My name is Luis Castillo, and I'm the practice director for our vulnerability management and remediation practice at Optiv. I'm excited to bring to you today a few slides to help me talk about a topic that I am really passionate about. Before I start, I want to recognize other members of my team who have contributed to the content that I will be covering with you today. Feel free to drop any questions in the chat throughout, and I'll do my best to answer them along the way. The objectives for today are to obtain a refresher on some basic definitions related to vulnerability management. I also want to provide an overview of what a VM program looks like, what functions and components make up a program. And finally, I want to share a framework to help you better understand the current state of your VM program and to help you identify areas of improvement to mature it. First, I'd like to review some basic definitions, just to ensure we have the same level of understanding when we refer to these terms throughout. There are more complex definitions out there, but I'm keeping things simple today. Let's start with vulnerability. Vulnerability is a weakness in an IT system that a cyber criminal can exploit to cause harm. Vulnerability can be a system flaw where a control is not strong enough and it's easy to break, like the lock on the left, which could be opened by a 5-year-old, but it can also be a system misconfiguration where even strong controls can allow the bad guys in if they're not properly set up. The person locking the door on the right didn't realize that the bolts were not inside the door frame, and so that makes it a weakness, even though the lock itself is very strong. We'll define vulnerability management as the cyclical process of dealing with weaknesses in IT systems. Per the definition, VM is a cycle. We don't do this one time and then forget it. You will always be dealing with new vulnerabilities in your environment, whether you have new assets or not. Once you discover them, you'll need to analyze those findings, those vulnerabilities, and figure out a way to prioritize them so that you know where to spend your efforts first. You will have to address those vulnerabilities by either patching systems, updating configurations, or finding alternate mitigations. And you'll need to validate that the fixes actually worked before you can claim victory. You will also need to measure and report information across all of those steps to your leaders and to your stakeholders. And before you can take a break, you will start the cycle all over again. All right, so what is a vulnerability management program and why do we need one? A VM program, we'll define it as the coordinated set of activities, people, and resources that continuously and proactively deal with weaknesses in IT systems to improve an organization's security posture. This is really your whole triad, right? It's the people, the process, and the technology coming together to be able to solve vulnerability management for your organization. But why do we need one? Well, to start, we are dealing with an ever-expanding attack surface. The complexity of our infrastructure just makes it so difficult to have visibility. Now you got on-premise, cloud, mobile, operational technology, etc. It's no wonder why we're struggling. The bad guys are very smart. They work around the clock. They found ways to exploit vulnerabilities. So a VM program can help you reduce the risk by identifying and addressing vulnerabilities and misconfigurations proactively. Then there's also the issue of compliance. Many companies need to follow some type of regulatory requirements, and having a VM program is most likely one of those requirements that can help you stay compliant. I would hope the companies are more motivated by risk reduction than compliance, but it is still a valid reason why you need one. Ultimately, a VM program should be an essential component of an overall cyber risk management program. To recap, a vulnerability is a weakness in an IT system that a cyber criminal can exploit. Vulnerability management is the process of dealing with those weaknesses. And a VM program is the people, the process, and the technology that together execute vulnerability management within an organization. Now that you have a much better idea of what a VM program is, how do organizations build or enhance what they have? Here's a simple 5-step approach to get you started in your journey. First things first, though, organizations need to know what it is that they have. They need to develop a current state view of their program and determine how mature it is. This will help you identify what gaps you have. Next, organizations need to develop or improve their governance model. This will be in a way that is aligned with that organization's needs. After that, you need to develop or update policies or procedures that are based on that governance model. If technology is not deployed or needs to be optimized, then you need to clearly define the requirements, right? And develop a technology design to address those needs. Once the design is in place, then deployment and configuration of technology will follow. The rest of this presentation will focus on this top bullet, which is really the assessing of the program maturity. The first thing we're going to do is break a VM program into functions. Across the top, we have governance, discover, analyze, respond, validate, and report. These are the big blocks that make up the processes, people, and technology for a VM program. You should be able to map your own VM program to these functions. And if you can, then you know you have a gap. Each of these functions has focus areas. Focus areas are the groupings of related characteristics or capabilities that can help you understand maturity level. We're going to designate a value or a score for each of the focus areas, ranging from 1 to 5, or 0 if it doesn't exist. The way we can describe each of these focus areas for an organization's VM program, that's what will tell us where their maturity, where in their maturity spectrum it falls. We will take the average of the individual focus areas and get a score for each function. And then at the end, we will take the average of the function scores to get the overall VM program maturity score. I know that was a lot. To make it easier to understand, I will walk through assessing a company's VM program using an example. That example may or may not be based on a true use case, but hopefully you'll find this useful, informative, and maybe a little bit of fun too. First, let's take a look at the governance function. Now, due to limited time we have today, I won't be able to go over each of the descriptions of the focus areas across all 5 levels of maturity. But what I'll do is I'll show you the anchors or the opposite extremes of the spectrum. This way you can actually see the variation between one extreme and the other. And you can probably picture the incremental levels in between. For today, I will show you a particular use case's description of their current state for each of those focus areas. And then I'm going to give it a score that is relative to our 0 to 5 framework. Spoiler alert, the majority of the organizations that claim to have a VM program will score somewhere between 1 and 3. If you are working with a company that doesn't have a VM program at all, then obviously there will be a lot of zeros for their focus areas. But we rarely see any organizations that score in the 4s and the 5s across all functions. Here are the 2 extremes that describe a level 0 and a level 5 for the focus areas under the governance functions. Again, although they're not spelled out here right now, hopefully you can picture the incremental steps that can get you from a 0 to a 5. All right, let's talk about our company's use case. In this particular use case, the leadership responsibility for the VM function is actually filled by a dedicated role with ownership responsibility. VM organization is defined, and may adopt a name that reflects its capabilities. For example, they'll call them the scanning operations team. We're going to rate the company's leadership and organization as a 2. They're doing some good things, but I think they can do better. Next is operational governance. In our case, there are no defined VM policy or standards. The processes that they do have are mostly ad hoc and producing consistent results. There's little to no alignment with the organization's mission and vision, or perhaps they don't exist. I think we're going to rate this company's operational governance as a 1. They really barely have a semblance of an operational governance. Finally, there is strategy. A security strategy may exist for this company, but it's not well documented. VM program maturity is not really an area of focus for their strategy. There is a defined operational budget for existing capabilities, but future capabilities are really not being planned. I think we'll rate this company's VM strategy as a 1. It's kind of lacking. Okay, together we get a maturity score of a 1.3 for the governance function. It's not great. All right, let's move on and take a look at the discover function. Here are the 2 extremes that describe level 0 and level 5 for each of the focus areas under discover. Again, I'm not going to spell out all the boxes, just the 2 extremes. In our use case, network monitoring is used to discover unknown internal assets and networks. Scope of VM does include those newly discovered assets. Their CMDB is immature or perhaps non-existent, and the VM toolset has become the de facto source of truth for asset inventory. Sound familiar? Yeah, we're going to rate this company's discovery scope as a 2. It really sounds like many organizations that I know or that we work with. Moving on, vulnerability discovery is performed using industry standard tools, running mostly unauthenticated network scans. There are some schedule consistency across the organization. It's not bad. Not bad. They're doing some good things. We're going to rate this company's discovery methods discovery methods and sources as a 3. They're almost doing what they should be doing. Finally, there is some useful context provided from an outside attacker perspective that includes CVEs and a relationship to the potential vulnerabilities in their environment. Again, it's not bad. We're going to rate this company's discovery fidelity as a 3. That means the data that they get is better than the average degree of accuracy, and it can really point them in the right direction. When you put them all together, we get a maturity score of 2.6 for the discover function. Yay, we double governance. That's actually great news. Okay, now let's move on to the analyze function and see if we do as well as discover. Here are our 2 extremes for analyze, and you can picture the steps in between. In our use case, vulnerabilities are aggregated using a standard format. Correlation allows grouping by a greater number of attributes now, such as those available via tags. That sounds pretty good to me. We're going to rate this company's data aggregation and correlation as a 3. Next, threat intelligence is used inconsistently and is mostly limited to manual references to known exploits that are published by third-party vendors or maybe that are publicly available. It's okay, but we can do better. We're going to rate this company's threat analysis as a 2. And finally, vulnerability severity, which is really typically based on CVS's score, is the primary metric that is being used in prioritizing remediation of vulnerabilities. Who else is doing this? And I mean just this. I think many companies really are, but there is a better way. So we're going to rate this company's prioritization as a 2. We can definitely do better. And now for the analyze function, we get a maturity score of 2.3. It's not too bad. It's way better than governance, almost as good as discover. So I'm optimistic. Let's continue. Now we go to the response function and see if we can keep our streak going of scores greater than 2. Here are the 2 extremes for respond, and you can picture the progression from 0 to 5. In our case, there is a defined patching policy, and there are patching processes which are increasingly more repeatable, and they are partially documented. OS patching is being performed using unmanaged tools or perhaps scripts. There is some consistency across, but not all teams. I think we see this a lot. So we're going to rate this company's patching as a 2. They are trying, but they can do better. Next, there are no remediation SLAs at all. Asset owners are not widely known or documented. That complicates remediation assignment. ITSM and change management processes and systems are immature or perhaps non-existent. That makes remediation management very difficult. That's the problem. VM programs exist with the ultimate goal remediating vulnerabilities. So if we're struggling with it, we're going to rate this company's remediation and mitigation as a 1. They are struggling. Finally, there's no defined escalation path. There's no inconsistent. There's a lot of inconsistency with escalation, really, and that's primarily due to the unknown asset ownership. There is an exception process, but it's very basic. There's little to no validation of business justification when submitting exceptions. Oof, this feels just like high risk all over. So we're going to rate this company's risk exception and escalation as a 1. They're kind of in trouble. This means that for the respond function, we get a maturity score of 1.3. Ouch. I had high hopes, but now it feels like we're going backwards. Not good here. Let's now move on and look at the validate function to see if we can turn things around. Here are our 2 extremes for validate, and you can picture the steps in between. For our use case, the scope of remediation and validation does include vulnerabilities found only on a discrete list of known critical assets. So it looks like we're only validating a list of known critical assets. I don't like to discriminate, but some validation is better than no validation, right? So we're going to rate this company's validation scope as a 2. Some is better than none. Next, remediation validation is performed manually using the same vulnerability discovery tool on an ad hoc basis when specifically requested. Okay, so we're doing some ad hoc scans to validate. Again, it's okay, and some is better than none. So we're going to rate this company's validation methods and sources as a 2. And finally, root cause analysis. It is encouraged, but not enforced or managed across the board. A process is followed to report false positives, and there are actions taken to reduce the risk of false negatives. But there's really little interest in understanding the true root causes of those vulnerabilities that have been validated. If it's not a vendor bug, they probably won't care. Again, there's some effort here, but we can do much better. We're going to rate this company's root cause analysis as a 2. When we look at the validate function, we get a maturity score of a 2.0. I think we're turning things around. We're back in the 2s at least. Let's see. We have one more function to go. Stay with me. Let's look at the report function and see if we can have a strong finish. Here we have our 2 extremes for report. In our use case, reporting is focused primarily on providing a list of vulnerabilities that can be sorted by severity and other characteristics. It feels a little rudimentary, doesn't it? I mean, that's how they all start. And so we're going to rate this company's reporting scope as a 1. They're just getting started. Next, reporting is generated within the vulnerability management tools and is extracted to spreadsheets for communication via email. This practice is still very much in use by many companies, but it's increasingly becoming less popular. We've seen a little bit of that trending the other way. So we're going to rate this company's reporting methods and sources as a 2. Finally, the target audience is mostly technical teams that are responsible for remediating vulnerabilities. The reporting cycle coincides with the scanning cycle, but it's typically no longer than monthly. Again, this is very popular, but companies are getting more strategic about their reporting. So we're going to rate this company's reporting frequency and audience as a 2. And now we can look at the report function and we see a maturity score of 1.6. Not exactly what I was hoping. Okay. We just went through an example use case that walked us through the entire list of functions and we were able to score each of them. I hope you are still with me and I didn't lose you along the way. But the overall maturity score for this company's VM program is a 1.85, which is typical. We talked about how most scores are going to fall between 1 and 3. And we are showing the results of our analysis with this spider chart. It's also known as a radar chart. And the chart helps us visually compare each of the function scores. The closer a point is to the center, the less mature that function is. The farther away, the more mature. So this tells us that discover, analyze, and validate are doing better, but governance and response need some work. Of course, we have all the detailed data to support this. Excuse me. But now I want to ask you, is this a good score? And how do you know? What level of maturity should this company strive to achieve? It's a great question. The answer is it really depends. And I apologize for my cough. Okay. So the answer to that is really depends. What kind of company is this that we're talking about? Let's say this is company A. It's a mid-sized construction company. There's a regional, I think I went too far. There's a regional client base. There's approximately 50 employees, maybe 100 assets, and they're mostly on-prem with some mobile. And now if we compare that with company B, which is a large pharmaceutical company, they have an international client base. They have 100,000 employees and just as many assets. They're all over the place, on premise, in the cloud, mobile, OT. Should these two companies be treated the same? Is this score more reasonable for company A or company B? Well, for this last piece of the analysis, we are working on identifying a differentiator, something that organizations can use as some type of corrective prism that can provide guidance on what is good enough for a company. We're calling it the risk tolerance factor. So what is risk tolerance? Risk tolerance is the degree of deviation from the level of risk appetite that an organization is willing to accept in order to achieve its objectives. Now, this sounds a little fancy, so I'm going to use a simple definition. For us, we'll redefine risk tolerance as the acceptable deviation in program maturity that an organization should be willing to accept. Deviation in program maturity. You can reasonably expect the company A will have a higher risk tolerance, and that means they do not need to score a 5.0 in their program maturity for it to be considered successful. They may be perfectly okay with a 2.0 because within each of the functions, there will be things that they can improve on. So we'll be able to tell them that. But overall, a score of 2.0 would be acceptable. On the other hand, 2.0 would not be acceptable for company B. Based on their profile, the risk tolerance would be a lot lower. Although they may not need to score a 5.0 either, they might need to hit somewhere around a 3.8. Now, as you can see, even if the scores for these two companies are the same, the recommendations for improving program maturity and the target score for each of them will be different. Our team is working on defining this risk tolerance factor and the approach to be used in order to complete our work with our VM program maturity model. So stay tuned. It'll come out soon. One final thought that I will leave you with. Building a mature VM program does not happen overnight. Maturity is the state of being fully developed. And many of you know that you've been doing this long enough that you're never really truly done. It's a process, it takes time. There are many elements that will dictate how much can be done and how fast. That may include budgets, financial priorities. You also need to build the right culture. You absolutely need to get the buy-in from your executive leadership, all of that. But what you can do to get started is define your VM goals, and then put together a roadmap that has clear initiatives and targets. Then try to get the buy-in that you need and make it part of your strategic plan. That's a good way to start. Okay, we're at the end of our presentation. In summary, this is what I hope to be able to achieve, right? My goal was that you would have obtained a refresher on some key vulnerability management concepts from vulnerability all the way to vulnerability management program. I also was hoping that you would receive an overview of the program functions and components. Our VM program reference architecture has 6 functions: governance, discover, analyze, respond, validate, and report. And then finally, I hope that you learned an approach that can help you assess VM program maturity in order to raise it. We did that by walking through that use case end to end and using our VM program maturity model as a guide. Finally, I want to thank you for tuning in today to listen to my presentation, and I hope you found it interesting, informative, and I believe it's going to help many organizations understand a little bit more about the maturity of their own program, and it will provide them with some guidance in order to improve it. Thank you, and have a great day.